Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School, and the purpose of this presentation is to give you some background information before you start reading Cry the Beloved Country. I'd like you to know a little bit about the author, a little bit about the setting in South Africa, and some of the stylistic elements of the novel so you kind of know what to expect as we get into the book. The author Alan Paton was born in 1903, and what's really interesting is that South Africa as a nation didn't even really exist when he was born. During the time of his life, he actually witnessed many changes in his land, and he became a champion of some of the poor and the minorities. In particular, he was known for founding a school, which was a reformatory, where they took kids who had gotten in trouble and instead of throwing them in jail and punishing them, tried to teach them new ways and give them an education. And as an advocate for his country, he was very well known and outspoken and beloved, and this book became his masterpiece. The setting of the novel specifically takes place in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a number of things have happened over history to Johannesburg, but particularly in 1886, gold mines were discovered, and this made this obviously a place that a lot of people wanted to be, to come and get rich from the gold. And this provides this very realistic setting for this racially based tension that happened in the country and that you see reflected in the novel, where you had a number of people who were native to the outside of Johannesburg, trying to move into the city. So you had this clash between the white settlers' cultures of the city and the poorer rural villages out in the countryside. And here you can see a little bit of the map. The Johannesburg is right here in the middle, now, and up in the upper corner there. Now, this is the farthest tip of Africa. So as you come down around, you can see Cape Town is down in here, and you have this combination of the Indian Ocean and where it meets the southern part of the Pacific Ocean coming in. So we're really talking about the very southern tip, obviously South Africa, the very southern tip of the continent, and right up here is Johannesburg, right in the middle. Now here's a picture of Johannesburg from 1931. Now this is about the time that Alan Paton would have been growing up and starting to write and what he would have been familiar with looking at. But Johannesburg today looks very much like a contemporary city, and you'll see a lot more of that in the story, which is set place in the middle of the apartheid. Now, we could do an entire course on the history of South Africa, so obviously we're not going to quite go there. But some of the key things that you may want to know is around 1487, right at the end of the century there, is when the Europeans first reached the Cape of Good Hope and started to discover all of these riches. Then it went back and forth, mainly as a Dutch colony for a long time. The British took it over in the early part of the 1800s, and slavery was abolished in all parts of the British Empire. The Dutch continued to fight with the Kaffirs, and the Dutch conquered the Zulus, who were the native tribes in the South African country. About the time of the middle of the 1800s, we had the foundation of the South African Republic, which was mainly the Boers, who were the Dutch farmers who had been in charge and sort of been living there for a good long time now. As I mentioned earlier, 1885 is when gold was discovered, and this led to a war between the British to gain control over this, and the British actually won. In 1910 is when we first see the establishment of the Union of South Africa, and it became part of the Dominion, part of the British Commonwealth. And in 1931, it actually won its independence. And then in 1948, a very key event happens. This is when the Nationalistic Party takes power and institutes the policies of apartheid. And in 1861, they became a republic. Now, we're going to talk about apartheid and some of these conflicts on a later slide, but just to see some of the history of how the Europeans had interacted with South Africa. A lot of the tension in the country came between the British or even the European imperialists and the Afrikaans, who were the white South African inhabitants who were descendants of these Dutch. And that, though, became an even little bit of a struggle compared to the struggle between the Afrikaans and the native black Africans. Mostly the native black Africans were part of the Zulu tribes. And you'll see some of these different languages even that show you some of the differences in the culture and perspective between these two groups who were sharing the same countryside. Now, what was apartheid, this policy that we talked about? Well, the very word itself translates in English to separate or separateness. You can even hear apart as sort of part of that, the idea that things need to be split. And this began in 1948 when the Afrikaner Party took over. And one of the first things they did was pass this series of land acts, and that set aside more than 80% of the country's land for the very small white minority who were about 10% of the actual population, and said that everyone else had to live in this other little bit, and the whites who were in control got to take care of 80% of the actual land. They also set up these pass laws that said that if you were a native black to the country, you could not be any place unless you had this particular document that gave you permission. So even within your own country, you decided you couldn't move around from various place to place. The government established separate facilities for whites and non-whites, limited the power of non-white unions, denied any participation at all of non-white in the national government. So you could not have the right to vote, you could not run for office, couldn't make any change. And the opposition to apartheid is legendary. It was both violent means and non-violent. And for those of you familiar with the American civil rights struggle, you'd see a lot of those same kinds of ideas. We had the same way that you saw the whites only sorts of signs and that kind of Jim Crow separateness in America, you saw that reflected in apartheid. And the same way that you saw everything from the bus boycotts and some of the nonviolent protests and methods that Martin Luther King advocated were also tried in South Africa as well. Obviously, most of you are familiar with Nelson Mandela, who became a key figure in the fight against apartheid. And apartheid was not appealed until 1991, when we finally had the majority population of non-whites were able to take over and have something to say when the government were able to stop some of these policies. Now, Cry the Beloved Country was published in the thick of apartheid, and it was really Alan Patton's attempt to try to get the world's attention about what kind of damage was being done to this country that he loved. It was published in 1948, and it's been translated into 20 or more different languages since then. And it's both an ethnic, political, and spiritual setting of how important this country and these people were, and also brings us to mind in these themes of these universal considerations about the power of love to restore people to each other, retribution, and what is justice. Now, the basic overview of the story starts off in a poor village where this Zulu priest, it was a Christian priest, but he's from the Zulu tribe, living out in the countryside, and gets a letter from the big city. And the letter says that his sister is very sick and that he needs to come into Johannesburg, into the big city right away and help out. When he gets there, he discovers even more disturbing news, that his own son, who had left a while back to go work in the mines and to go get jobs in Johannesburg, and hasn't been heard of really in quite a long time, has been accused of the murder of a white man. And the father goes in search of the son, has to learn how to navigate the big city, and learns these painful truths about what his kid has been up to, what has happened to his family, and what life is really like in Johannesburg. So you have this kind of part murder mystery, part travelogue as he learns his way around, and part social commentary, and an awful lot of this idea of spiritual growth and the power of reconciliation. Now, as you pick up the book and start reading, you're going to notice some interesting things. For one, Alan Paton does not use traditional punctuation of dialogue. He uses a series of just small slashes to say when people are speaking, and it gives this kind of free flow style to the novel. You'll notice a lot of the names and the language are from Zulu or from Afrikaans, and they may be unfamiliar to you. And there is a glossary in the back of the book that will help you through that. A lot of the novel has this real poetic quality. There's entire pieces of chapters that could be read that look more like poems or even hymns and songs to tell the story. And a frequent point of view shift. Sometimes he's talking to you directly and he uses the second person address and says, you will think of this and you will do that. And sometimes he's this omniscient narrator pulling back and kind of describing everything. So that goes back and forth. Pay attention to the names of the characters. There's a lot of symbolism. There's frequent allusions to biblical stories, and that leads to some foreshadowing. And then just this general idea of an initiation story and the hero's journey. And we see this over and over again from Beowulf to Oedipus and Odyssey, where this naive but sensitive individual gets put into some new place or situation, has to deal with the crisis, and in the process kind of grows up and changes, and now knows something that they didn't know about the world. And that's that classic kind of coming of age or journey story. And you'll see this throughout the whole book as we get into the story. There are two main settings of the novel. The first is Dot Sheni, which is the village out in the countryside. That's where Stephen Kamalo, our protagonist, lives. And that kind of represents the old ways, the Zulu customs, these family values and spiritual sense, and that deep connection to the beauty of the country and the community that can be built. And then there's Johannesburg, which by contrast is this big, huge modern city. It's ruled by the Afrikaner Party, which are the whites, and it's kind of a place where anything goes. There's a sense of lawlessness, of crime, of corruption, and that the city itself is corrupt and people who go there can become corrupt. And it's a place of great loss and where people and families get separated. And these two settings are going to really help you understand the theme a lot as we get through. The novel is short, but it's divided into three parts. The first book really deals with the sorrows of the Kamalo family, and it's the father's journey to Johannesburg, and then we learn about this other character, Arthur, who's been murdered. The second book kind of shifts point of view to the family of this boy who was murdered, Arthur, and we learn the sorrows of the Jarvises. We have a courtroom trial, like a court drama, and then these two families meet up together. And then book 3 is Stephen Kamalo's return home, and this idea of darkness. They go into one of the darkest places of the soul that you could get to, but then the dawn and this new secret of life and how to succeed and how to make sense of everything that's happened. Some of the themes that we're going to track throughout the novel include the love of fellow man as your solution to the disintegration of culture. So when everything is breaking down, it's that individual compassion and connection. Also the theme of families. You'll see a lot of pairs of fathers and sons, mothers and brothers. The contrast between people who are obsessed with wealth and things of the earth and spiritual wealth instead. And then the concept of a journey, both physical, literal journeys and metaphorical, spiritual journeys. Now, you might want to think just for a minute about the title of the novel itself before you get going, because you could actually interpret this grammatically in a couple of different ways. So, Cry the Beloved Country, is that the country itself is crying because it's disintegrating and everything that makes it wonderful is breaking apart? Or is it an imperative command, as in you, personally out there, you should cry for the country because it's falling apart? And when we say beloved country, is that current tense? Or is that a past tense idea that this country is no longer beloved? Or is it something that's an adjective that's still applicable today? So there's some different ways to even think about the title before you get into the book. Some of the motifs to keep an eye out for as we go through include travel, clothing, how people wear things and what kind of items they put on, farmers and the land and the people's connections to the land, letters and mail and how things get sent back and forth, money and how it's used, home and what home means to different characters at different times, the mines and the use of the resources. Watch for a particular bird called the titahoya that shows up at a couple different places in the novel. And then the symbolism of meals and food and communion. And finally, secrets, what people know and don't know, what they share and what they don't share. And these are all some of the images that you're going to see throughout the whole book as you read. Cry the Beloved Country is a very important book, and it's also a really excellent book. And like the country itself, it is also a very beloved book. Not only did it call attention to the problems of apartheid, but it also helped enlighten any reader or country who might be going on dealing with this kind of issue, and particularly people in America who were often unaware of the fact that other countries were struggling with these kinds of issues as well. So it's a great story just from the sense of a murder mystery that has to be solved. It's a great family story about the bonds between parents and children and the bonds that we can form with each other. And it's a really important story in terms of the social justice. So I'm looking forward to reading it with you all, and I hope that you enjoy your first couple of chapters. That's it. Bye now.